From the Russian Revolution to the Cultural Revolution, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the Red Wedding, Marxism has been a force for good and evil. So the question is, who was this man? And how did his ideas cause so much destruction and inspire so much hope? Before we start the story, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button to receive all our new posts. That's what we'll investigate today. This is Karl Marx in 100 scenes or less. Let's begin. Scene 1. Who was Karl Marx and how did his ideas change the world? Well, he was a German philosopher and economist who lived between 1818 and 1883. Though he didn't realize it, Karl Marx would become the most influential political thinker of the 19th century, laying the foundations for modern communism. Scene 2. Born in 1818 in Trier, Germany, Marx was born into a middle-class family. His father was a Jewish lawyer. But like many German Jews at the time, he converted to Christianity because anti-Semitism was rampant in Germany. As a result, Karl and his 4 siblings were raised in the Christian faith. Scene 3. His father was strict and expected his children to follow in his footsteps and become lawyers, but young Karl had other plans. He was a curious kid who devoured books and questioned everything. And even though he came from a well-to-do family, he developed a rebellious streak against authority and the upper class. Scene 4. When he was 13 years old, he moved to Bonn and enrolled in university there. But instead of studying, he got involved in student politics, partied hard, and got into fistfights. As a result, he had to transfer to Berlin. Scene 5. Now at Berlin University, Marx finally immersed himself in learning. He spent hours in the university library reading philosophy, law, and history under the dim glow of oil lamps. He graduated with honors in 1836 and soon after earned his doctorate in philosophy. Scene 6, however, his academic career was short-lived. Marx was considered a radical even back then, and no one would hire him as a professor. To make ends meet, he worked as a journalist, writing about politics and culture. Scene 7, soon he became editor of a radical newspaper called Rheinische Zeitung. But the government pressured him to moderate his views or shut the paper down, so he chose to flee. Scene 8, first, he moved to Paris where he befriended some of the leading thinkers of the day. He met the French philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who once declared property is theft. He also met the socialist Charles Fourier, whose ideas of utopian socialism greatly influenced Marx. Scene 9, but after a while the French police started watching him. They warned him to leave France or face deportation, so he moved to Brussels in Belgium, where he continued writing and agitating. Scene 10, but again, he ran into trouble when he co-authored a pamphlet criticizing the Belgian government. The authorities revoked his passport, so he moved to London where he spent most of his life. Scene 11, living in London wasn't easy. He lived in poverty, subsisting on cheap food like potatoes. He had 6 children, 3 of whom died in infancy. His wife had to work as a washerwoman to support the family. Scene 12. Still, Marx had access to one of the greatest libraries in the world, the British Museum, and he spent his days there reading the latest works on economics, history, and philosophy. That's where he read the works of the English economist Thomas Malthus, which inspired some of his theories on population growth. Scene 13. After arriving in London, Marx began writing for a radical American newspaper called the New York Tribune. His job was to cover European politics, which suited him perfectly. He used his position to promote socialist ideas. Scene 14. While living in London, Marx befriended a wealthy factory owner named Friedrich Engels. Engels was one of the few people who could afford to live comfortably in London, and he was fascinated by the city's extreme poverty. He wrote about it in a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England, which he co-wrote with Marx. Scene 15. The 2 friends also collaborated on another important work, one that would change the course of history. In 1848, they co-wrote a pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. It only took them 8 weeks to write. Scene 16. The manifesto starts with a famous line, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." Then it goes on to explain what communism is and why it's inevitable. According to Marx, it's inevitable because all of history is really the story of class struggle. Scene 17. Throughout history, there have always been 2 main classes of people, the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. But Marx argued that at any given time, one class has more power than the other. For example, In feudal societies, the landowners had more power than the peasants. But during the Industrial Revolution, the tables were turned and the factory owners gained more power than the workers. Scene 18, according to Marx, the more powerful class uses its power to exploit the less powerful class for their own benefit. For example, the factory owners set the workers' wages at whatever level they wanted. That way, the workers could survive, but they would never earn enough to join the capitalists or the ruling class. The result is an endless cycle of exploitation. Scene 19, but Marx said this wouldn't last forever. Eventually, the exploited class would get fed up and rise up against the oppressors. They would overthrow the capitalist system and establish a new society based on equality and freedom. Scene 20, right in the Communist Manifesto, was just the beginning. Marx went on to write his magnum opus, Das Kapital, which was originally titled Das Kapital, Critique of Political Economy. Volume 1 was published in 1867. It was a dense and detailed analysis of capitalism and its inner workings. Scene 21, Marx begins Das Kapital by defining capitalism itself. He says it's an economic system in which the means of production are in private hands and operate for a profit. The means of production are things like factories, farms, businesses, and machines. Scene 22, Marx goes on to say that capitalism is doomed to fail because it contains its own negation. By that, he meant that capitalism exploits the workers and creates massive inequality. And if this continues, a revolution will eventually take place. Scene 23, he also argued that capitalism would collapse under its own weight because it produces more goods than it can consume. As a result, there will be overproduction and economic crises. Scene 24. In Das Kapital, Marx identified 5 ways that capitalists increase their wealth. The first is through the labor of the workers. As we mentioned earlier, the capitalists pay the workers as little as possible while charging customers a high price for the products they make. The second is through technological progress. The third is through the appropriation of the labor of others. Marx pointed out that colonization is really just another way for capitalists to get control of natural resources and cheap labor. The fourth is through the creation of monopolies. Monopolies allow the capitalists to set prices and restrict supply. And the fifth way is through financial speculation. That is getting rich by buying and selling financial assets. Scene 25. With all these methods, capitalism makes great strides forward, but it's unsustainable. Marx argued that the contradictions within it would eventually bring it crashing down. Unfortunately, Marx didn't live to see it happen. Scene 26, he died in London in 1883 at the age of 64. He was relatively unknown outside intellectual circles, but his ideas would soon ignite revolutions around the world. Scene 27, in the 20th century, communist regimes rose in Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, Laos, Cambodia, and elsewhere. Half the world came under Marxist rule. Scene 28, of course, critics argue that Marxist theories ignored basic human rights and led to authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Millions suffered and died under his so-called utopian ideas. Scene 29, nevertheless, Marx's ideas continue to have an impact. In academia, you can find entire departments dedicated to Marxist studies. And in politics, you'll find various political parties espousing Marxist ideas. Scene 30. So was Marx right? Or was his dream a dangerous illusion? We'll let you decide. But one thing is for sure, love him or hate him, Karl Marx changed the world forever. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out our series on the greatest philosopher.